Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today's video is going to cover Chapter 4. We're going to talk about ethical guidelines for psychological research. So this chapter we're going to go over some historical examples, times where maybe ethics weren't exactly enforced, or even times before the existence of some of the current ethical standards. Then we're going to go over our core ethical principles, the things that control and determine how research happens now, and then also talk about specifically some of our guidelines for psychology, not just science in general, but the ones that apply very particularly to psychologists, looking at the APA ethical principles. And then we're going to get into ethical decision making and trying to find a balance between doing research that's going to be beneficial to the public, but also weighing those ethical dilemmas of having to do things that aren't necessarily good. And we'll get into all of that throughout the lecture today. So before we begin, you should have watched two videos, one giving us a little bit of background on the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, which illustrates a bunch of major ethical violations. And then the second being the Milgram obedience studies. And that's, again, that difficult ethical balance between getting information and knowledge that's really beneficial, but having gotten it in a very unethical manner. So you can find those two videos on our e-class in the same section you got to the lecture. And watch those before we continue, because I'm going to just assume from here on out that you have the background on what was going on in each of those cases. And now we're going to start talking about the ethics associated and why these two historical examples are so controversial and why they're so closely related to this discussion of ethics and things that we should consider. So for our Tuskegee Syphilis Study, there were three major issues, three major unethical choices made by the experimenters that we want to focus in on today. So the first of these was that the participants in the study were not treated respectfully. So these participants, they weren't told whether or not they had syphilis, they weren't informed about cures for syphilis that came up, that were discovered and put into common practice as the study went on. And they were even coerced into participation because of some of the situations that were going on. So they were promised free health care, and they were told that if they donated their bodies to science, that their burial would be fully covered. And this promise of funding to people who were in a very poor neighborhood, who had very low incomes, they almost felt like they couldn't say no. And in addition to all of this, this ties into the idea of informed consent, and that was severely lacking in this case. The participants weren't given enough information to make a valid decision, and they couldn't consent to a lot of the procedures that they were exposed to because they weren't told what they were in advance. So we can summarize it as saying that they weren't treated respectfully, but it goes so much beyond that. And there were so many awful things going on there, which again is why we talk about the Tuskegee Syphilis Study as a major ethics violation. So our next point kind of goes into more detail on that, and the participants were outright harmed by the study. So not only were they treated disrespectfully, not only were they misled, but they were physically harmed by this study. So they weren't told about a treatment for syphilis, and so they continued to suffer from the disease when they could have been easily treated and cured of it. Many of the men in the study couldn't even read or sort of look into and research other options. And as we said, a lot of them weren't even told that they had syphilis. And some of the participants throughout this process underwent painful and even dangerous procedures. So in the video, they talked about the fact that a large number of participants were convinced that they needed to have spinal taps, and that would help them get more effective treatment. But a spinal tap is a dangerous and invasive procedure, and it was painful. So people were physically harmed, and this caused them a lot of problems. And our last major point about the ethics here is how they chose participants. And from the video, you saw that the participants were specifically targeted. The participants were a disadvantaged social group. So the researchers specifically searched out an area of low-income African American men who had high rates of syphilis. So they targeted them. And the problem here isn't so much that they only had participants who were African American. The problem is that African Americans were the only people who were suffering the risks of the study, but other people, other groups, could benefit from the outcome of the research. And we'll get into more about this equal share between risk and benefit as we talk about some of the modern ethical practices that are enforced nowadays. But at the time, this was something that there weren't rules in place to prevent. And so all of these things taken together give us a pretty dark picture of how badly this study violated what we have as standards for ethics today. And here on the side, we have a picture of, at the time, President Bill Clinton, and it took him decades after the study to actually step forward and issue a formal apology. So the participants and their families, the people who suffered through this unethical experiment, didn't get a formal acknowledgement of their suffering until years and years and years later. But it did happen, for what it's worth. So now for our other side, our Milgram obedience studies, they raise some different ethical questions. So the first of these is the idea of debriefing. So we're not going to delve into just how awful these studies were, because we've already kind of covered some of the problems with the first study. We're going to look at some of the stuff that came afterwards. So we're acknowledging that the studies were terrible and they put the participants through a lot of traumatizing things. The big problem that we're going to focus on is debriefing, or in this case, the lack of debriefing. So what debriefing is at the end of a psychological experiment of some kind, you will sit down with the researchers and the researchers will come clean. They'll explain to you what was going on, and they'll let you know what was the experiment looking at, what were we doing, what happened. And in the case of these Milgram obedience studies, the participants were never quite completely debriefed. And so there was a little bit of effort. So sometimes the participants would see the person who was, or who they thought was being shocked, and they would be told that it had been part of the experiment, but not always. Sometimes the debriefing was a simple matter of showing them that the person getting shocked was okay, and that was it. Milgram had argued that by telling people that the study was a sham, he ran the risk of those people telling others what was going on. And he didn't want what was going on to affect other people in his study. So he kept quiet about it. And so without a full debriefing, a lot of these participants went home thinking that they had actually gone through this experiment and given increasing levels of voltage shocks to this person. And even if they were told that the person was okay, they were faced with the idea that they had caused another human being physical harm. which can weigh very heavily on someone's mind. And so there's a major question here of, did this study cause a lot of psychological damage to the participants? And in some cases, people argue yes. The participants felt awful, and they had recurring nightmares about this, and they started questioning who they were as people for having done something so terrible. So it had a major effect on these people, even though they never actually did anything. So an interesting dilemma for them to be in. And the next point kind of brings us back to that idea of balancing risk to participants and benefit to society. So a lot of ethics is about finding this balance. In this case, they wanted to have a debate, or they ended up, I guess, having a debate. Researchers after the fact, looking at the Milgram obedience studies, argued that the risk to the participants, these problems that came from not debriefing them properly, from putting them through such a stressful situation, those risks were too high. Whereas other people might argue that the benefit to society, everything that we learned about human obedience and how far people were willing to push to follow someone's orders, some people argue that those benefits were worth the discomfort of a small number of people. So we have these competing views where some people think it was worth it and others don't, and ethics is pretty well defined by this debate, this balance between trying to learn something but trying to have that benefit outweigh the risk. And you can imagine, if we're trying to quantify the benefit of a study, and we're trying to quantify the risk or the detriment caused by some psychological trauma, it's a really difficult thing to quantify. And that's one of the major reasons why ethics are so difficult to enforce. It's pretty hard to have a set number where you can talk about, oh, well, this study, the benefit clearly outweighs the risk, but in this other study, the risk is too great and the benefit is too small. How do we draw that line? And this was sort of the environment that all of our rules and regulations regarding ethics have come from. We had these studies and many, many, many others that led us to these difficult questions about ethics that prompted a revolution within the field that led to the development of actual guidelines that decreed what scientists could and couldn't do, and started establishing boards that helped us decide when the risk could outweigh the benefit, or when the benefit was worth the risk. And that's what we're going to talk about next. And this leads us to the Belmont Report. So in the 1970s, the United States put together a group of people who started creating this formal statement of ethics guidelines, and it involved experts from around the world, where they wanted to put together a list of principles, of ideals that researchers should follow to have ethical research. And so this study led us to three main principles for conducting ethical research. And we're going to talk about each of these very briefly today. So the first of these is respect for persons. Then we're going to talk about the principle of beneficence, and then the principle of justice. So starting at the top with our respect for persons, the first major component here is informed consent. And we already kind of touched on this, but this is the idea that research participants should be free to decide for themselves whether they would like to participate in the study. They have to be informed about the risks and benefits of the research, and then they have to consent to the study after knowing all of the facts. So they have to decide if they're going to participate from a station where they're informed of the potential risks to themselves and also the benefits. And so part of informed consent also includes the caveat that participants can't be coerced to participate in research. So you can't offer them large sums of money, or you can't say that if they don't participate, something bad will happen, because otherwise they're going to participate even if they don't want to. And so this informed consent means that they can choose to participate and that they can't be pushed into participating. And this comes with sort of a second piece that we have to consider, and this is the idea that certain groups of people are less autonomous. So some people aren't capable of making an informed decision. So groups like children or people with cognitive disabilities, they can't conceptualize the full extent of the risks and the benefits, and so they can't really give informed consent if they can't grasp all the information. So there are parts of the Belmont report that specify that people in these sort of risk-prone groups, these people who can't make an informed decision, have to be protected by others. Either a guardian has to give conformed consent, or you can't include them. There has to be some consideration for the fact that they themselves can't make an informed decision. And this special group of considerations also includes people like prisoners. And this sounds really weird, but their reasoning is that if you are a prisoner and you're presented with the option to participate in a study, a lot of times, because of the mentality of prisoners and the way that their world is established, if a guard or a official in the prison comes to you and says you have the option to participate in this study, a lot of prisoners view that as a demand rather than a request. So they think that they have to participate. And that mentality means that it's not really informed consent, it's a little bit closer to them being coerced to participate. And so again, special considerations need to be taken so that people are actually willing to participate and don't feel like they've been forced to participate. So on to our next principle, the principle of beneficence. The word beneficence here refers to doing good. And so this principle states that researchers need to take measures, they have to try to protect participants from harm and protect their well-being, and oh my goodness, I'm having trouble with words today, and they need to ensure their well-being. So the researchers have to do everything in their power to prevent their participants from being hurt or harmed unduly. So obviously, that is something that arose in direct contrast to what was seen in that Tuskegee Syphilis Study. So the Tuskegee Syphilis Study happened long before the Belmont report was made, but this principle was probably included because of the violations, the problems that were seen in that study and other studies like that. And so this principle is where we start considering that weighting of risks and benefits. So the risk to a participant shouldn't be larger than the potential benefit of the results of the study. And so in these cases, sometimes research happens where you have to make people uncomfortable. In our department, there are researchers who study things like how people handle the thought of death and how they handle thinking about their own future death and the finality of life. And this field, also referred to as terror management, specifically has to put people into a situation where they think about those very disturbing thoughts. And so the idea here is, yes, you are making people uncomfortable for a time, But the hope is that the benefit of the study, what we learn about how people cope with those feelings, can help us know more about humankind in the future. And you also have to weigh the fact that, well, it's something that shouldn't be a long-lasting mental state, and the researchers should keep in mind that it's not a comfortable way to be, and they should allow the people to stop thinking about that as quickly as possible. But as we've already said, this is a difficult one to talk about because it's not always easy to quantify harm and benefit, especially when we're looking at psychological principles. So again, we have to kind of consider that this is difficult to quantify. And our last one is the principle of justice. And this is where we go back to that Tuskegee Syphilis Study and talk about the fact that there was an imbalance between who was suffering the risk of the study and who could benefit from the study. So our principle of justice looks at the balance between who participates in research and who benefits it. So in our Tuskegee Syphilis Study, only African American males were part of the study. They suffered all of the risks, they got all of the consequences, but any group, any race can have syphilis. And so the things that they were discovering about syphilis by watching these African Americans suffer, the benefits applied to people of every race and of every socioeconomic status, not just poor African Americans. And so in the case of that Tuskegee Syphilis Study, they violated the principle of justice because there was an inequality in the sharing of risk and benefit. And so this principle was put into place to try and ensure that something like that doesn't happen again. So if the study were ran again today and they were following this principle of justice, then the participants would come from all different areas of life, different races, different socioeconomic statuses, and different genders. So get the whole picture of the people and the population that can suffer from syphilis should also be represented in the group of participants in the study of syphilis. Now, the Belmont Report wasn't created specifically for psychology. The Belmont Report was meant to cover sort of a broader base of anyone who deals with humans in research. And so there are other guidelines that have popped up, specifically more focused on other fields of study. And so for psychology, a lot of our guidelines come from the APA ethical principles. And so you'll see the acronym APA fairly often because this is the American Psychological Association. And APA have done quite a few things that affect psychologists as a whole. So if you've heard of APA formatting, that's the same group, and they've set aside a bunch of principles for how we publish papers. So they have guidelines for pretty much every aspect of performing psychological research. And so they have a section all about ethical principles. So the American Psychological Association has this set of ethical principles of psychologists and a code of conduct. And this is a document that's been regularly amended and refreshed so that it's current and still applicable. And we won't go into all of the specifics on this, but we will touch on some of the major points that apply to most psychological research. And so we're going to look at their basic principles and the 5 general principles. So comparing our Belmont Report 3 basic principles and then APA's 5 general principles. And you'll find there's quite a bit of overlap here. So beneficence, which was in the Belmont Report, shows up in our APA principles here as well. And they go a little bit further and say beneficence so doing good, but also non-maleficence. So they're including the idea that not only are you protecting people, but you don't want to do anything bad either. So you're going to treat people in ways that benefit them, that's the beneficence side, but also don't cause suffering. And so you want to be doing research that's going to be of benefit to society, but also not causing harm to your participants and making sure that you're treating them well. That isn't a huge deviation from what we've already talked about. For justice, the next one shared between the two, is that same idea of striving to treat all groups fairly. So your research participants should come from a sample of the population that can suffer from whatever you're looking at. So you have to be aware of biases. You can't target any one particular group and make them bear all of the risks of being a participant. So everyone gets treated equally in research. And then our respect for persons gets converted over to respect for people's rights and dignity. Again, very similar there. So you have to recognize people as autonomous agents. So you protect their rights, including a right to privacy. And that's something that we didn't talk about with the Belmont report. Also, the right to give consent for treatment or research. That's that informed consent. And also the right to have participation treated confidentially. So this is the idea that if you sign up for research participation, they're not going to publish your name in the paper when they publish their data. There's not going to be a way for anyone else to know that you participated in a study. So everyone is given that autonomy where your role in the study is not shared with anyone else. And that's a pretty major part of psychology and other research as well. And we still have to keep in mind that we have special groups that need special considerations. So again, not a ton changed here. But here's where we get just a little bit different, where APA adds in fidelity and responsibility. So you have to establish relationships of trust and accept responsibility for professional behavior. So basically, act as a good person, be a good scientist, and be someone who's trustworthy. And then the last being integrity. So you want to make good science. You strive to be accurate, truthful, and honest in your role as a researcher, teacher, or practitioner. So you want to be truthful. You want to be exactly what you're presenting yourself to be. So don't lie or cheat or falsify your data. So this one here is about dealing with your participants, but also about how you conduct your research. So this would cover the area of don't falsify your data. Don't publish something in a misleading way. So lots of other little considerations there. But all of these taken together are giving us the idea that you should be a good person in your research. You can't take advantage of people, treat everyone fairly, and don't lie, cheat, or steal. So specific guidelines that ensure that everyone follows the rules. If you've ever had to read through some of the APA's ethical guidelines, it is a long and detailed document. And we're going to focus on just one very specific area because it applies to a lot of the psychological research that we're going to be talking about. So of their 10 more detailed ethical standards, we're going to talk about standard number 8 because it's most relevant for psychologists as researchers. And so these are specific to research, and they talk about a bunch of things that are relevant for us. So the first of these is the inclusion of institutional review boards. And so what this means is that there are bodies or groups of people who are responsible for making sure that research using humans as participants is going to be conducted ethically. So at the University of Alberta, we have an institutional review board, a group of people that will read over all proposed research that gets conducted by researchers at the university. And if this board ever has any questions, if they think that anything is going to be conducted that is not ethical, they will flag it and send it back to the researcher and say, you can't do that unless you can give us justification for why it needs to be done. So there's a built-in oversight to make sure that people at the university, at the institution, are conducting ethical research. The next specifies some of the details of informed consent. And this specifies that this explanation that we have of our study has to be given to participants in written form. So if you've ever gone to research participation, maybe as part of 104 or 105, at the beginning of the study, they sit you down and they hand you a piece of paper that outlines all of the details of the study, all of the potential risks to the study or that come from the study, as well as some of the benefits that they can talk about at that time. And at the bottom of the page, you sign giving your informed consent. So that piece of paper is mandated by this standard in the APA specifics. So the next couple of places are interesting. So deception is a very interesting section to talk about. And deception is when your researcher at the beginning of the study doesn't give you all the details. And this is kind of hard because our section on informed consent says that you need to be told all of this information so that you can make an informed decision. But sometimes there are specific cases where it's deemed reasonable to deceive a participant. In most of those cases, you'll still be told an accurate analysis of the risks that you could suffer, but they might hide some of the reasons of where those risks are coming from or why. And the reason that they're allowed to do that is because if you knew what was going on, if you knew every detail of the study, you might actually adjust your behavior. And if you're changing your behavior, then the research itself isn't studying what it's supposed to be studying, and why would we conduct it then if we can't study what we were trying to study? So in some cases, the institutional review board will deem it acceptable to include just a little bit of deception, as long as it doesn't put the participant at any greater risk than what's outlined in their informed consent. Our next section is debriefing, which we've already kind of talked about. And this is the idea where after the study, especially in studies where they've had to use some deception, they'll give you a debriefing session where they have to sit you down and tell you about any points where you were misled. So this is usually done verbally, though sometimes they'll also give you a follow-up piece of paper, sometimes called a debriefing form, that just tells you what was actually going on in the study if they couldn't give you all the details in that informed consent form. The next section goes into research misconduct. And this is basically, what are the consequences of doing something wrong? So the first of these is what happens for data fabrication? What happens if you lie or manipulate your data or present it in a false manner? And that's a pretty negative thing. And a lot of that's going to be enforced by institutional review boards, but also sometimes larger boards. And for both data fabrication and even into plagiarism, if you violate ethics, your institution can actually pull your ethical backing. And if you're at an institution as a researcher and the institution says they won't give you ethics approval, your career is pretty much over because you can't perform any experiments at all unless you have ethics approval. So if you violate any of these standards and the review board pulls your approval, you're basically done. And so this gives this review board some teeth to actually enforce these rules and to have real consequences for researchers who don't follow those rules. And then the next section goes into animal research. So not all research in psychology deals just with humans. There are researchers who look at psychological concepts, but using animal models. And a lot of the animal research has similar ethics, but with their own sets of rules. And we're going to talk about that on its own separate slide. With animal research, the same as with human-based research, there are lots of different standards and boards and enforcement agencies that outline rules and regulations for how you can work with animals and also how you can't work with animals. So there's lots of legal protection for laboratory animals. So we have to make sure that they're treated well, that they're given food and water, that they're handled correctly, all sorts of rules, lots of regulations around it. With a lot of our animal care guidelines, the ethics committees will focus on the 3 R's. And so when you're trying to get approval for animal research, you have to list your considerations for our 3 R's, the first of which being replacement, the next being refinement, and the last being reduction. So for replacement, they're asking you to find alternatives to using animals. So for example, I've done research in the past looking at how songbirds categorize different sounds. But you can also conduct research looking at categories of sounds, but using computer simulations. My lab has done some work on artificial neural networks that are meant to model how songbirds group sounds into different categories. So in that case, an artificial neural network experiment, you've replaced the need for using an animal by using a computer model. So that would be an ethical choice because I've used an alternative method to having animals. Our next R is refinement. And in refinement, we're looking at how those research procedures could be altered to reduce the distress that the animal feels. So is there a way that we can make them more comfortable? Is there a way that we can make them less scared or frightened or any of that? How do we make them feel the best that they can feel in this situation? And then the last point is reduction. And here we're trying to use the fewest number of animals possible. So in a lot of studies, we'll talk about using the largest N that you can get, and N just being our sample size. So if you're looking at a study with humans, you want to have as many people as you can afford to study. But when we start considering ethics, if this study is causing people discomfort, then you no longer want to have as many people as possible in the study. You're now going to start looking for, well, how small of a sample can I use and still be sure of my results? And we use that same mentality in animal research, where you would look at how few animals can I have in this experiment and still get good, solid statistics at the end. And so you have this balance between when you have a larger sample size, your statistics are usually cleaner and you have a more concrete result, but you also want to make sure that you are not distressing animals without need. So you have to balance, again, these 3 R's along with all of those legal outlines on how you can and can't treat animals. And so I'm sure you can tell there are tons more details behind the scenes on rules and the same kind of, make sure I say the right word, review boards. There are animal ethics review boards at all institutions as well. So there's lots more here, but for the sake of this class, we're just touching on everything very briefly. But the take home again is that you're trying to ethically balance the welfare of our animals, their legal rights, and the research that you're trying to do that should have some kind of beneficial output. So we again come to this idea of ethics as a balance between risk and benefit, and having some strange balance in the middle, hopefully. And so making these ethical decisions requires that balance of priorities. And that's where those ethical review boards come in. And we don't talk about it a ton here, but there are sort of the institutional level of review boards. And if they need to, they could talk to higher up boards if they needed someone else to help them make a decision. Maybe there's an experiment and it could cause a lot of risk, but the benefits are also very large. So maybe they have a larger debate on if the risks are more important or if the benefits are more important or what, but there's always an ongoing debate. And so we need to weigh the potential harm to both human and animal participants against the knowledge that we'll gain from the research and what benefits that has for society. And so on that note, we are going to end up chapter 4 here, and we'll move on to chapter 5 next time.